Blackpool's on the north side of the city. It's kind of jutting out into the countryside from Shandon. It was a very kind of industrial area, very busy village. It kind of had a village atmosphere, lots of shops, lots of pubs. People lived there, you know, that was their kind of world as such. And it was kind of a hive of activity with all the kind of industrial background and workers going to work. You know, every morning you had massive factories. So you had the Sunbeam, or what was called then the Cork Flax and Spinning Factory, and had over 1,000 workers. And then you had Goulding's, and then you had the Murphy's Brewery. So you had a lot of industry there. And of course then as well you had cattle. You know, it was just this kind of interface between the urban and the rural, and there was a lot of kind of cattle dealers there settled in Blackpool, and the cattle would actually come through Blackpool itself. So you know, you had a really kind of a very eclectic mix of activity.
Well, before the outbreak of the First World War, Ireland was caught in the grips of the Home Rule crisis. The whole issue of Home Rule had dominated political debate in Ireland and in Britain ever since the latter part of the 19th century. And in April 1912, the third Home Rule Bill was introduced in the House of Commons. And unlike its two predecessors, there was every expectation that this bill would pass all stages.
Well, there was a lot of political agitation. You know, people weren't happy with the status quo of being a part of Britain, the Union. They weren't, you know, and that was reflected in Blackpool itself. Very much so. The whole kind of agitation for Home Rule was very evident in Ireland, but also very evident in Cork and in Blackpool. You know, because you had political meetings and also divisions within Blackpool between different factions, between the Redmondites, John Redmond, and William O'Brien.
As tensions were rising, there was a very real possibility that civil war would break out. And after the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June 1914, while the rest of Europe were focused on the political and diplomatic manoeuvrings that were taking place in the month of July, the period known as the July Crisis, the eyes of the British government were focused on Ireland primarily because, like I said, there was a very real fear that civil war or some sort of civil conflict would erupt over Home Rule. So Ireland was a very, very tense place before the outbreak of the war, and in many respects the outbreak of the First World War and Britain's declaration of war on Germany relieved some of that political pressure in Ireland and gave both sides an opportunity to stand together.
Austria felt that they had to assert their power over Serbia because they were a multinational empire, and they felt very threatened by Serbia and the nationalist that kind of claims that they had. So they decided to go to war, and that provoked Russia, which in turn provoked Germany, which then in turn provoked France. So you know, you had this kind of concatenation of events that brought Europe to this kind of just cataclysm, abyss. Now Britain was an island, and we were a part of Britain, you know, and we were a part of that, you know, outside of it as such. Now I don't think Britain liked the idea of Germany taking over Europe. That's, you know, and they would prefer the stalemate, prefer peace to carry on as it was. But Germany invaded Belgium, and Belgium was a neutral country, and Britain had signed a treaty with Belgium to say that we had to uphold their neutrality. So once Germany invaded Belgium, that was a great cause, you know, to rally Britain and Ireland into the war. And that rhymed with people in Ireland, you know, because we were agitating for Home Rule, and it was a type of nationhood, and it was a great rallying cry for us.
Exactly. Well, this barracks, now Collins Barracks, was then known as Victoria Barracks. It was the largest barracks in Munster. It was a major staging post for the British Army and a major centre for recruiting young men. Britain declared war on the 4th of August, and on the 6th of August, the 2nd Battalion of the Leinster Regiment and others, reservists that were recalled to the colours, headed off, left the barracks, went down to the Great Southern and Western Railway Station and headed off to Britain, and from there heading off as part of the British Expeditionary Force to the front. But in the meantime, the call to arms went out, Kitchener's famous call to arms, and thousands of young men from Cork would have poured through the gates of this barracks. to enlist in many different units of the British Army. And I think in the first 3 months alone, some 800 men would have come in through the gates here and joined the British Army. So, I mean, there was probably a lot of them would have been motivated by a sense of adventure, and indeed a sense of patriotism. 1914 was before the Easter Rising. Britain's army was their army. Britain's war was Ireland's war. Many people would have considered that to be the case. Others would have been caught by the appeal to fight for the freedoms of small nations. The politicians were calling upon young men to take part in the war. Many church leaders were calling upon young men to take part in the war. Their employers were calling on them to take part in the war. So it was a natural thing for these to do. And they would have been no different from young men in Britain, young men in Germany, Austria, across Europe. They all would have been caught up in the euphoria of that was created by the outbreak of war. The great sense of patriotism, the great sense of fighting for your country and fighting for a common cause. Cork would have been no different from that. And many young men from Blackpool would have passed through the gates of what was then Victoria Barracks, taken the King's shilling, put on the uniform of a British soldier and headed off to the very different many battlefields of the war. We estimate between 8,000 and 10,000 men would have served with the British Armed Forces from Cork during the war, and over 4,000 with connections to the city and county of Cork lost their lives. That's horrendous when we think in today's terms. And for many people looking back, it seems like a mere statistic. But we must remember that every one of those deaths was somebody's husband, somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's cousin, somebody's neighbour. Each one of those deaths were a huge personal tragedy. And that's something we should never forget.
My relative was my great-grandfather, William Foley, and he came from Blackpool.
There was James Jones, he was killed in Gallipoli. Dennis Jones, killed in France. Joseph Jones, who was the eldest of the family, and my father, Patrick Jones. And they came from Millfield Cottages in the Mallow Road.
My granduncle, William, or Bill as he was known, Higgins, he was born actually in Kantuck, but the family moved to the old Mallow Road just outside Blackpool.
Frederick William Oakley, he was my father's older brother, so I am his niece.
He was my father's brother, elder brother, Patrick Foley, and he was actually my uncle. So that's who he was, and we came from Blackpool, at 56 Dublin Street, just opposite Ganey's pub, near the grotto there.
My grandfather was Richard Noonan.
So his name was Pat, or Patrick Kiley. So Pat was my grandmother's brother. They were 8 in the family, and they lived in Blackpool in Thomas Stravis Street.
My relative's name was Robert Spillane. And my connection with him would have been that my grandfather and Robert's mother, Mary Deasy, would have been brother and sister.
My grandfather, Gus Birmingham, and his brother, Mick Birmingham.
There was John Douglas Banks and Patrick Banks, and they're my great-grandfather's brothers, so they'd be my granduncles.
They lived in Millfield Cottages in Blackpool.
There was a Daniel, a James, a Jeremiah, a Jerome, and a Con. 4 of them were from Daddy's side of the family, which were O'Donovans, and 1 was from my grandmother's side, would be Con O'Leary. The 4 from my father's side came from 35 Commons Road, and my granduncle from my grandmother's side came from Millfield Cottages.
About 350 men went off and fought from Blackpool, which had a population of about 4,500 at the time.
Many of them would have joined the different Irish regiments, like the Royal Munster Fusiliers, which would have been very popular. The Leinster Regiment would have had big connections here in Cork, the Connacht Rangers. Others would have headed off to the Royal Artillery, like Tom Barry, who later became quite famous in Ireland's fight for independence. More would have headed off to the Merchant Marine, or indeed the Royal Navy.
Yeah, we're here on Penrose Quay. This is where the office of the Cork Steam Packet and Shipping Company was. This was the major shipping company for Cork City. And Cork City, as you know, is a port city. And without being a port, it wouldn't be here, wouldn't exist. So its connection to the sea via the River Lee here is vital for the story of Cork. There was a very deep connection between Blackpool and the port, because a lot of people actually worked on the docks and they worked on the ships. So many people from Blackpool who were working on the merchant marine with this steam packet company died during the First World War.
And these were the people of in the Merchant Navy in Cork that saved us from starving by running huge risks, bringing foodstuffs and every kind of stuff, materials into Ireland, you know.
And to realise that, you know, they were just doing their job. You know, they were leaving their homes and walking from Blackpool onto here, onto the ships to transport goods to Britain and bring back goods. You know, goods that were vital for the upkeep of Irish people and Cork people. You know, coal, foodstuffs, and that was their job. Now they were, of course, a part of the war effort because, you know, if Ireland didn't survive, if Britain didn't survive, then, you know, obviously it would have meant that was the end of the war, and that was the idea, I suppose, of the German U-boats. German U-boats then were there to attack merchant ships, stop economic supply of Cork, of Ireland, of Britain, and then force Britain and Ireland out of the war and win the war for Germany. So that was their tactic.
So it's hard to quantify exactly where they went, but one thing is certain, and I have travelled many of the battlefields all over Europe, and in nearly every cemetery that you go to, you'd find Irish names, you'd find Cork names. That's a tragedy, a huge tragedy. It's the biggest tragedy to hit Cork since the famine.
They were from Spring Lane, Blackpool. Robert's address actually was 85 Spring Lane, Blackpool. He was working in the flax mills, and that was later Sunbeam Woolsey, located in the Mallow Road. What I do know of Robert was he went to Blackpool National School. In his youth, he was part of the Glen boxing team that was located in Blackpool. In 1912, the Cork Examiner published a photograph of the Glen boxing team taken with Páirc O'Mahony, heavyweight boxing champion. It also stated that it was the start of the boxing season, and first into the ring was young Spillane and Kid Buckley, and they fought 4 rounds to a draw. Robert joined the Royal Navy in January 1916, but at that time surplus recruits were sent to the Royal Marines to work as infantry. He was sent to the Western Front as part of the 2nd Royal Marine Battalion. In September 1916, 3 months after he was deployed to the Western Front, Robert was invalided back to the UK. But he did recover, and after 12 months, exactly a year, he was sent back to his unit. And at that time, his unit were preparing to take part in what would have been known as the Second Battle of Passchendaele. The battle began on the 26th of October 1917 with the objective of capturing German-held territory on the Passchendaele Ridge. On the first day of the battle, They did succeed in capturing the key objectives, but unfortunately a lot of people were killed in the heavy fighting, and Robert was one of those. Robert's body was never recovered, and today he's commemorated on the Tyne Cot Memorial in Belgium. We're at Tyne Cot Memorial in Belgium, and we're here to commemorate Robert Spillane, who passed away on the 26th of October 1918. He was killed in the Battle of Passchendaele, and his remains were never recovered, but he's commemorated on the panel here in Tyne Cot Memorial. I'm going to lay this wreath in memory of Robert Spillane on behalf of the Spillane and Deasy family.
As we are here now, we're here in the Tyne Cot Cemetery, and we're along the Tyne Cot Memorial here, which combined has 38,000 casualties. Most of them we don't know who they are. One in particular, the man we're here today is this man here, Cornelius Callaghan. Cornelius Callaghan was part of the 2nd Royal Mus Fusiliers. He was killed here on the last day of Passchendaele. He got his Distinguished Conduct Medal here. He was the most decorated soldier from Blackpool in the war. We're in the area of Passchendaele here now, and if you look west of here, you can see the town of Ypres, and the soldiers came out of there, and the Germans held this strong point here, and there's still a number of pillboxes here in the cemetery. If you look at the ground, you can see the strong point that the Germans had, and this whole area was just pure carnage. And by the time the British took it, there were many thousands of lives lost. Well, I mean, I think about 80% of the graves here are unknown, in that we don't know who's buried in them. There are certainly people, certainly of all of the panels around here, nobody knows where they're buried. They could be in graves, they may be still around here in the ground somewhere. I think as you come closer to the panels and see the amount of names on the panels all the way around, it just gives you, it really does blow you away as to the amount of, people that were, slaughtered in this whole area. The third man that we're commemorating today is a man called Jeremiah Baldwin. He was from Dublin Street in Blackpool. Jeremiah Baldwin fought with the Middlesex Regiment, and he fought and died at the Battle of Boudenside on the 4th of October 1917.
From what I can get from the records, he joined up in 1912, which is 2 years before the First World War. And he spent most of his time in France. I've heard from other sources that he was actually one of the first from Blackpool to actually go to France. So he was actually stationed there before the First World War started. The regiment was the Irish Guards. And we have some pictures of him. He's with a flag bearer, and it seems to be a hockey team. He did send some postcards, all right, to my dad, which would be his younger brother. And when I saw them first, I got a kind of a shock, because, dear John, I hope this finds you as it leaves me, that kind of thing. And I thought, God, he never kind of said anything. But sure, they weren't able to actually, tell him where he was or tell him what he was up to. They were just a reminder, to hope he was still in good health, that's all. And in this area here, on the 15th of September, there was a battle going on here. Actually, the battle in the use of tanks was only starting, and this was the first battle in which tanks took part there up the road. And he was actually wounded in the knee in the 15th of September, just here now. And he got over that, but in 1918 he got shot again in the knee, and I think that finished the war for him, unfortunately. So he came home, and he hasn't died here in this land as these people did here, these lads. But he did die very early, 30 years of age.
A lot of them didn't want to even admit that they had been in the First World War.
Some of them spoke about it and people called them boasters. Do you know what I mean? Or they got a nickname or something.
Judging by the neighbours, he was certainly, there was no animosity or anything. He was taken back as one of their own, and he got a job in Gouldings.
No, he never spoke about it.
He wouldn't talk about it, you know. It was something that, you know, I actually think it was horrific. I think people did sublimate a lot of what happened, you know. It just, you know, because it was a different world. I mean, you know, the carnage and the destruction and the death that people saw, like.
He used to always say like that they saw things that no young boy should see.
Nobody ever spoke. The man was trembling continually, looked very, very down, very depressed. I didn't speak, and it was obviously he was what they call nowadays post-traumatic stress. And when we were growing up, it was known as shell shock, you know. So that to me like hit home what happened to these individuals during the war, and there was really no treatment in those days. They didn't understand what was wrong with people.
Today we're standing here in an area known as Aubers Ridge. So 100 years from 1915 on, we're standing here today, and you know we're still turning up bits of battlefield relics. But you know, in May 1915, there were many units of the British Army settled along here. You know, just here on our right, we had the Sussex Regiment, where we're standing at the moment. We had the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, Welsh Fusiliers, and some of the Gurkha Indian regiments further over. The Royal Munster Fusiliers had come from their billets near the town of Bethune, which is west of here, on the night of the 8th of May. They travelled along Rue de Bois. They'd stopped along the way about 8 p.m. and they'd received the last absolution from Father Francis Gleeson, their priest. They travelled along the road and they settled up here. They took over the trenches that night on the 8th of May. The following morning at about 4 a.m, the British artillery, which was positioned about a mile north of here, started bombarding the German trenches, which were along here, just behind us. So the whole idea was to penetrate some of the barbed wire and the trenches which the Germans had been occupying. At about 5:20 a.m, the 2nd Munsters came out of their trenches. The Germans started firing him. There was, you know, lots of casualties that morning. The CO of the battalion, Colonel Rickard, was killed. During the advance, the 2nd Munsters got caught in no man's land and ended up being killed by their own artillery. So there was a lot of casualties here on the day. There were 3 individuals from Blackpool here. 3 of them were killed, and 3 of those I mentioned on the Latoria Memorial, which is up here at the end of Rue de Bois.
Originally, I think the Banks family came from Belfast. The father of the family was called Alexander Banks, and the mother was Mary Maxwell, who then became Mary Banks. And these 9 boys were her sons, and 2 of those, as we've connected them now, are Patrick and John.
So some of them, there was quite a lot in the family. Some of them were carpenters, and some of them worked in the mill. Quite a lot of people in Cork at the time were in the reserves, one part or another, because it basically, a lot of people didn't have a lot of money, and it actually gave them another extension to their money, and they were able to go and they got training. That was one, and then a lot of them, when the war started, decided that they'd go, and it was going to be a great laugh and adventure and something for them that was going to be different, and of course the war was going to be over by Christmas. So they headed off with all their friends, and not a lot of them came back. Patrick Banks and his friend James Gleeson went to war. Basically, they went off on this great adventure, and they actually went on the Battle of Aubers Ridge, which was a huge battle, and there was an awful lot of people killed, and it was really traumatic. They went over the top together, as they say, when they went out of the trenches, and both of them were blown up together, and there was no sign of their bodies ever found. So they're commemorated, but there was no body found. Right, there are 4 men commemorated here who were never found. They are Patrick Banks, James Gleeson, Timothy O'Leary and Michael Donovan. And I'd like to lay this wreath in commemoration of those 4 men.
Three of them were killed on the night of May 1915 at Aubers Ridge. It was the worst day for Blackpool soldiers, worst day for Cork soldiers in the war. Now, James Gleeson worked in the flax factory, later to become Sunbeam, and he lived in next door to Patrick Banks. And we believe that they could be friends because they landed in France the same day and with the same regiment and ended up in the same battle together. And they lived in the same kind of housing back, very small area down in Blackpool called Milford Colleges. So more likely they were friends and they died together on the battlefield. So it's very, quite poignant. And one was Protestant and one was Catholic. So there's kind of dimension to that. That's very unusual, I suppose, for Southern Irish. There's another person here who's commemorated, and that was Timothy O'Leary. Now, Timothy O'Leary was the first soldier from Blackpool to be killed in the war. He was killed in the 10th of October 1914. He was from Dublin Hill, and his father was a labourer. This is actually him here, and these are his brothers. All the brothers were in the army as well and fought in the First World War, but they survived. But Timothy, unfortunately, was killed.
The Kileys had a flour and mill business. I think they bought and sold flour, and they came from Whitechurch originally and settled in Blackpool, and did a pretty prosperous flour business in Blackpool at the time. And Pat and his brother Bartholomew, or Bat, left for Australia in 1911 or 12, we think, before the war, maybe 1 or 2 years before the war. Why they left, I'm not sure, but the two brothers at the early 20s left for Australia. What we know is that Patrick joined the 11th Battalion in Perth. He went to Perth, and Bob or Bartholomew Bat went to Melbourne. He didn't join the war. I tried to understand why Pat, but I suspect the word is that there was a lot of, you could say, marketing of the World War, and there was a lot of, your country needs you type thing. And Pat must have felt that he wanted to join, even though he was in Australia at the time. And he joined the 11th Battalion in just before the war. So Pat was on the first day of Gallipoli, the War of Gallipoli. Is it the Anzac Bridge? He definitely landed, so he was killed on the first day of the landing of Gallipoli. He definitely landed there because there is a story told of some witness who was with him in the trench. I think he was Australian. I never found out the name, but he was interviewed in Australia after the war, and the last time he saw Pat was going over the top on the Anzac Bridge or near the Anzac Bridge. And he was missing for 6 months, so his mother, obviously, like any mother, would be very upset, didn't hear whether he was dead or alive. And she told the story that she often saw a soldier sitting at the end of her bed and didn't recognise the garb, the gait. And, well, whether it was years after the war or subsequently, she didn't recognise it until she saw a soldier in Cork City with the hat, with the Australian hat. She said, "That's the soldier I saw." Whether I was trying to figure out, was there ever Australian soldiers come through Cork City? I've never been found out whether it was a ship or whether she saw them or whether she saw it on a film or a photograph, but that's the family story, that she didn't recognise the uniform until she saw a soldier walking down Patrick Street. And she said that was what she was convinced it was Pat coming to visit her.
They then got him a position as a temporary postman in Blarney, and he cycled from the old Mallow Road all the way to Blarney. And as he arrived at the post office in Blarney, the First World War had been declared. And as an ex-regular soldier, he was automatically drafted and sent back to the UK to form the 1st Battalion of the Irish Guards. He was only 26 years old and was obviously highly intelligent and had a good military background, because he was posted to France, and unfortunately in the first year of the First World War he was shot by a sniper.
No one really spoke that much about them, only they went off to war and that was it. So I was in the Legion Remembrance Sunday one year, a few years ago, and I started talking to this lady, and I was telling her that I had a few uncles killed in the First World War, but I knew their names, but I didn't know anything else about them. So about a week later, she rang me and said, I'm after finding your uncles. Right? I was crying for the week because I had said to my dad, I do my best to try and find out where his uncles died and where they were buried, and I do my very best to try and visit. So 2 of them survived and they went back to Canada as far as I know, and the other 2 were killed. Also my great-grandmother's brother, he was killed as well. Well, I know very little about James, but he went to Palestine, and as far as I know he got pneumonia and died. Daniel Donovan, they didn't use the O as far as I know, Daniel Donovan, he fought in Vimy in France, and he's buried in France. That was the grave I visited. And they were very brave men, and I had and I still have great admiration for them.
He was born in Withering Lane, just off Pope's Quay. Well, listening to my grandmother for years gone by, she said that my grandfather signed up, I think he was only 15, but he said that he was 16, and he went off to France, and I think he was bringing supplies to the front. And at one stage, the story that my grandmother have told us is that he was bringing supplies to the front at one stage, and the horse came to a standstill and wouldn't move, and when he got out he realised that the horse's legs were after being blown off. Now Richard came home, and he was one of the lucky ones, I suppose, to come home, because there was a lot of them didn't make it home. And he married my grandmother, Mary Murphy, who came from Blaisby Street, and they moved to Slattery's Avenue in Blackpool, where they lived and raised their family. And later they moved up to Farnclary, and Richard was 68 when he died. He died of a heart attack.
Picture of Frederick William Oakley. He lived in the family house, which was the Green Distillery, which my grandfather and a lot of my relatives worked in Irish Distilleries, or Cork Distilleries Company as it was then. Thomas Dave Street, or York Street it used to be. He joined the South Irish Horse. He was killed, I believe, more or less the first week that he actually was in action. That's a picture also probably just as he joined up, and it says on the back the date of his death, March 1918.
We're here in Pozieres Cemetery, commemorating Frederick William Oakley. This is in the Somme region. Now, Frederick was one of the youngest in the family. He was part of the Royal Irish Regiment that faced the massive onslaught of the German army on the 21st of March 1918. This is kind of Kaiserschlacht that was trying to break the stranglehold of the Allies in the Western Front and create a victory for the German army. And his regiment, along with other Irish regiments, faced the real brunt of the onslaught, and one of the worst days for Irish soldiers, for Cork soldiers. And unfortunately, Frederick died on that day, on 21st of March 1918. And we're here to commemorate him, and I'm here to lay a wreath on behalf of the Oakley, Redden and Rolfe families, in memory of their relation, Frederick Oakley. I'll lay it here.
been forgotten about, really, to some extent, until lately, really, you know.
People had to be very careful how they spoke about World War I. If members of the family having served in the World War I, Ireland was a changed country after the Civil War.
So for many men, when they came back, like I said, they left one no man's land and came back into another no man's land, because by 1918, in the eyes of many Cork people, the British Army was starting to be seen as the enemy. They were the force that was stopping the people of Ireland getting self-determination, self-government. They didn't want that anymore. So these veterans had to come back, like I said, not as heroes, but in some cases as villains.
Historically, it's absolutely abominable. They were not only were they not remembered, but many of the veterans who came back and who were ill, and their families were suffering terrible poverty, they were actually spat upon, discriminated. They were not allowed to get jobs. And the only organisation that looked after those for that period of time was the Royal British Legion.
They really need to be brought back into the limelight and talk about what they fought for.
It was a quite brave thing to do, because that was the way they thought. It was fighting against an evil. Now, fighting for the British Army, in some parts of, in some traditions, that wouldn't be seen as a positive thing. But I think there's two thoughts there. And I think, well, in our family, I think that both sides were respected each other's opinions on that one.
I never knew Irish people were involved in this, in this major world event. To me, it was a revelation to find out that there were so many people. And my own and I was always quite proud of the fact that my grandfather was, part of this world event. That to me, growing up, said, gee, yeah, he was a part of this, but it meant nothing to me. Insofar, I grew up with the idea that it was a futile war. It was mass carnage for no reason. People were cannon fodder. I had these kind of broad stroke kind of views of it that dismissed it, and never engaged with it,
Well, lately, I must say there's a kind of a revival in honesty, I suppose, and in how you look at these people.
And I think it's well overdue the time, because they did make a lot of sacrifices, and I see the sacrifice they made, especially with my great grandfather and the family he left behind here. Well, where we are now is the Etro British Cemetery, which was an orchard in 1914 through the time of the war. The Munsters had come following the retreat from Mons, which was up northeast of here.
The German army were massive, the million. They were kind of swarming over through Belgium. And all you had was about 60 to 80,000 British soldiers, trying to stall them, and they were forced to retreat towards Paris. And the second was the Fusiliers then were sent back to stall them, as to allow the larger British army to retreat further back, and they encountered the Germans at Etro.
So by the morning of the 27th of August of 1914, they had reached the towns of Ossey and Fesme, which are just north of here. They tried to hold back a whole load of Germans who were following them down. So the battalion had settled just north of here on the canal, which came through the village of Ossey. So during the day, they progressed down here, being pursued all day long by the Germans. By about 7 o'clock, they'd reached here. The rest of the British Army were about 7 miles away, gone at that stage. So by about 7 o'clock, they were surrounded. There were different companies of Germans over here. There were Germans over here. There were Germans down at the railroad, which is just at the start of the village here. And they continued to fire whatever they had left at the Germans. The Germans were obviously all over the place. By about just after 9, most of the officers had been killed at that stage, and command of the battalion fell to a young lieutenant called Lieutenant Gower. So by by 9:13, 9:14, he decided that there were enough being killed, he had lost enough men, and he called a halt to whatever was going on. And so this was where they all fell. So on the morning after, when the light of day came around, they found out that this one battalion had been surrounded by 6 battalions of Germans. So the Germans allowed them to bury their dead here, and as you can, this is quite different than many of the cemeteries on the Western Front, in that the stones are lined up against the wall. So there are 2 mass graves here with over 100 Royal Munster Fusiliers. It's mostly Royal Munster Fusiliers, but I think there are 7 Royal Artillery men who would have been the men who carried the guns with them along. The officers are buried here, and all the men are buried here. My great-grandfather, William Foley, who was from Blackpool, was a sergeant in the battalion. He had been one of the Oakham Tentables. He'd come over with the battalion from England 2 weeks prior to the 27th, just on the 13th of August. He had sailed with the battalion, and he was one of the men captured here. Over 250 men were captured here, and they all spent the rest of the war, certainly most of them would have spent the rest of the war in captivity in Germany.
They were soldiers at start. Now, my grandfather, Gus, was 21, and he was with Royal Artillery. He was working in a shop, so he was probably a reservist, and he was called up straight away, and he ended up landing in France in September 1914. So with the Royal Artillery, the 2nd Brigade of the 6th Division. 6th Division was a Cork division. So they were based in Victoria Barracks, Collins Barracks. So he was within a month. He was on over in France. Now, luckily for him, he was with the Royal Artillery, so they weren't in the front line. They didn't have to go over the top. Now, people from Royal Artillery were killed, but luckily he survived, the 4 years there. His brother, Uncle Mick, he was with the 2nd Battalion Royal Munster Fusiliers. This is my granduncle, Mick Birmingham. He was from Dillon's Cross. He was a professional soldier before the war, and when the war broke out, he landed in France with the Munster Fusiliers on the 13th of August. I believe this was his first engagement with the German army, and he ended up on this plot here, and he was captured along with the rest of the Munster Fusiliers who were captured on that day, including some other soldiers from Blackpool. I suppose this is a picture of him in his running uniform, running with the Munster Fusiliers, and I suppose it's poignant to see some other people here, because some of these people died, and one over here is a P. Cohan, and he was only 19 years of age when he died on this site on the 27th of August. And then I have some pictures there of the Blackpool soldiers who were captured on that day. This is Jay Donnelly. He was captured, and this is John Connors, and he was actually with the Spring Lane brass band, and he was captured on the day as well. So there are some of the Blackpool soldiers who were taken prisoner. There was over 165,000 prisoners in the whole 4 years of the war, and they underwent terrible conditions. It was a lot of starvation. 3,000 died of starvation. There was 500 killed by brutality. So it was a lot of forced labour. So it was really tough 4 years for the people. But my granduncle survived, and he ended up as a bus conductor actually in Cork City. So he was on the buses for the next 25 years after the war.
John Douglas, he was in another battle in the 4th of October 1918, and his body was found. He was obviously blown up as well, but his body was found, and he's actually buried in the Pas de Calais. We're in Templo Le Gerard, and we're remembering my great-granduncle, John Douglas Banks. He was one of 4 brothers who came to serve in the war. And John Douglas Banks was killed at the Battle of La Catelet on the 4th of October 1918. And now I'd like to lay a wreath on behalf of the Banks and Fitzgerald families in commemoration.
We welcome this evening His Honourable Winston Peters, Minister of Foreign Affairs of New Zealand. We welcome you all to this daily act of remembrance.
Not alone does the Menin Gate Memorial function as a memorial, but it also serves as a major centre of commemoration. Every night at 8 o'clock, a ceremony is held here at which the local fire brigade assemble and play the last post in honour of the men who gave their lives to free their country from German occupation in the First World War. That ceremony has been attended by people all over the world and people from all parts of Ireland. And it's that ceremony that the Lord Mayor will be attending, the Lord Mayor of Cork will be attending, to pay his personal tribute on behalf of the people of Cork to the 190 soldiers whose names are inscribed in this memorial, who gave their lives, who sacrificed everything they had to liberate Belgium and in the cause of world freedom.
Well, this is the Munster Cross, erected in 1925 and paid for by subscriptions from the people of Cork. And the visit of the Lord Mayor of Cork to this particular place is of huge significance. In many ways, it's the culmination of the Great Sacrifice project, which started many years ago in order to identify and then remember the 4,200 servicemen from Cork City and County who died in the Great War. And the visit of the Lord Mayor is of huge significance. It gives closure to that particular project, and it gives recognition to the families of all of those people for the sacrifice that they made when they did their duty in this place over 100 years ago.
Standing here at this amazing place in Ypres, it's hard to imagine, with 55,000 names on the walls behind me, the implications for the people who lost their lives in this great war. It's hard to imagine what this meant for their families, their parents, their partners and their children who lost their loved ones. It's a very important and sobering experience to be here and to reflect on that we must never, ever see this again.
A lot of men from Cork are remembered here, particularly in Blackpool on the north side of the city. And it's a time to reflect on their passion and their contribution. And as Lord Mayor of Cork, I am honoured and privileged to be here to recall their memory during World War I.
Now there's 4 men here from Blackpool who are commemorated on the Menin Gate, and obviously their bodies were never found or identified. The first was James Sheehy. He was from Quarry Lane in Blackpool. He was actually the youngest of the Blackpool people to die in the war. He was only 17 when he died in the first Battle of Ypres. That was in November of 1914. And then 2 days later, there was Patrick Horrigan. He was killed with the Munster Fusiliers in the first Battle of Ypres. And it's kind of tragic, that 10 weeks earlier, there was a report in the Examiner about him playing pitch and toss on Blackpool Bridge. We're here in the heart of Blackpool, on Blackpool Bridge. next to the church. And I suppose it's late July, early August 1914. And something happened here on the bridge. There was a group of people playing pitch and toss. As a game that, it could be for betting, a common game at the time, pitching coins against the wall and see who gets closest and all that kind of stuff, so, just pass the time. And I suppose in Europe at the time, it was falling apart. Europe was going to war at this very time now when these people were playing this game, and involved in the game was a Patrick Horgan. And he came from 12 Commons Road, which is just up the road there. And he was playing against a Patrick Daly, who was also from the Commons Road. And seemingly a fist fight broke out between Patrick Horgan and Patrick Daly, and another man intervened to help Patrick Horgan, and he ended up then in court on the 5th of August 1914. And the previous day, Britain had declared war and were involved in the war. So here you had Patrick Horgan on the bridge, involved in this fracas as Europe was delving into this terrible cataclysm. And Patrick Horgan would be involved in that. Suddenly, 10 weeks later, he's at the front, and he was killed. So it just shows the tragedy, that war can bring so quickly to a community like Blackpool. And then there was Con Lennon. This is Con Lennon here. He was in the army, and he left the army, and he got work in the Cork Examiner, as was known then. And he was obviously still a reservist of some sort. So when the war broke out, he joined up straight away, and he was killed on the 10th of February 1915 at Saint Eloi. That was just localised fighting, in trenches. He was sadly missed by his work colleagues in the Examiner, and it's ironic, I suppose, today that where he lived, Malin's buildings across the way is where the Examiner is today. And then the last person to be killed that's commemorated on the Memorial Gate is William Henry. William Henry was killed because he died on the 4th of August 1917. So they played an instrumental role, I suppose, the Irish Army and all the regiments in defending Ypres and making sure that the German Army never breached that salient.
It's always difficult when you come to a place like Ypres today to imagine what it must have been like for the Irish soldiers who fought here. If you can, you have to use your imagination to try and in some way or other figure out what it was like for the soldiers from Blackpool who came through this town and were going to the front line out in this direction here. Out there, 10 miles away, is the village of Passchendaele. The front line is between here and there. And as they were going through this particular area, everything here was demolished. All of the houses were completely flattened and pulverised from the artillery fire which was coming in on top of them. And as they were going out to take over the frontline positions, mostly in the evening and in the night time, they would have seen the casualties coming back against them. And then we have to try and understand what would have been going through their minds as they were dealing with that and having at the same time to go and do their job as professionally as they could. It's very difficult now when you're here on a beautiful day, glorious sunshine, to try and imagine that. But 100 years ago, that is exactly the problem that faced all of those men as they went to do their duty.
Well, we're in Burnafay Wood Cemetery, and we're in the Somme. And 5 men from Blackpool were killed during the Somme battle. But we're here in this cemetery, I suppose, in relation to Patrick Doyle. And this is Patrick Doyle here. Now, Patrick Doyle was a member of the Spring Lane Band. He was from Rogers Avenue, which is just very close to Spring Lane in Blackpool. He was with this band. That was a very political band. Well, we're here on Spring Lane, and this was the home of a very prominent band in Blackpool called the Spring Lane Band. And the members of it were very political. they would support a lot of political meetings in town, and they would march up and down. It changed its name to the Roach's Guards Band in honour of Gus Roach, who was a Redmondite politician in Cork. The idea now, right, a lot of times that the soldiers who went off to war were there for economic reasons. Now, undoubtedly, you know, people in Blackpool, soldiers in Blackpool, did join up as reservists to gain a bit of money. But the idea that they were apolitical is far from the truth, you know. And that band now had many clashes, violent clashes with other bands in the city, in Blackpool itself, because they were Williamites, William O'Brienites, and they were Redmondites. So he was very political in some respects, and he was a musician, and he was also a poet. And he was with the 1st Battalion at Royal Munster Fusiliers. He actually saw action first time in Gallipoli. He landed on the 25th of April 1915 in Gallipoli with the Munster Fusiliers off the River Clyde boat. Lots of deaths, you know, coming off there, well protected by the Turkish forces. He survived it though, but he did see his neighbour from Millfield Colleges, Michael McAuliffe, who died on that day. And but he survived it, and he wrote a poem about it actually, and it was published in the Cork Examiner.
It's entitled From the Trenches. On the 25th of April, we landed in the Dardanelles, not knowing what was before us. But we heard a shot and the shells. Oh, it was a terrible day, I'm sure I won't forget, when the Munsters and the Dublins went through the valley of death. Death by fire and water, when leaving the River Clyde. But like Irish noble heroes, they bravely fought and died. They charged the hills like devils and killed them every one. They took the village on the right and captured 2 big guns. And as they were advancing, the blood boiled in their veins to see our comrades dying upon the Turkish plains. And as the night was closing, we lay down to have a rest and returned to bury those who nobly fought their best. 'Twas then we dug our trenches, but to sleep we could not go. We were thinking of our comrades who were lying far below.
Now, he came then after Gallipoli. The Munster Fusiliers came back to France, and they were part of the Somme campaign. Patrick Doyle then was killed on the 4th of September 1916. So I'm here to lay a wreath in memory of a poet, a musician, and a soldier. Patrick Doyle, who was fondly remembered in Blackpool and sadly missed by his mother and brothers.
James died in Gallipoli, and he died in 1915. And Dennis was the last man from Blackpool to die. He died on the 5th of November, 1918. And I often heard my father saying that when the war was over and people were celebrating, like the week the war was over, my grandmother didn't know that Dennis was killed. And later on, a week or 2 after, they got a letter saying, missing, presumed dead. But it took weeks. You see, communication wasn't like it is now. It took weeks before people really knew whether a person was missing or dead. And then seemingly you'd get a letter then with the King and Queen sympathy if they were dead.
And then we come to the Foray de Montmal, and this was the last military engagement of the Second Munsters, and it was here then that on the 4th of November that Dennis Jones was killed. Now he was killed actually on the same day as one of the most famous poets of the war, Wilfred Owen, and Wilfred Owen was only killed just a few kilometres down the road there. So they were part of the same movement, same attack on the same day, and Dennis Jones then was killed.
The forest of Montmal is a state French forest who cover about 9,000 hectares. It's majority composed of oak and beech. This is a forest who was marked from the World War I because 2/3 of this forest was cut by German army.
La forêt de Montmal a été complètement dévastée. Les Allemands ont prélevé toutes les essences de bois qu'ils voulaient et n'ont gardé qu'une partie de la forêt de manière défensive.
So the forest was badly impacted by the war. The German army was taking all the wood from the forest to build the trenches. So there was just a very small forest left at the end of the war.
Mais pendant ces années, nous sommes sous l'occupation allemande et les populations ont à souffrir énormément d'une occupation très dure.
So, but we are here now. This area was invaded by the Germans, and this was very difficult for the local populations to deal with the German.
At the end of the war, Germans must pay the disaster, and they paid for the forest with seeds of oak for regenerate the forest. In the name of Office National des Forêts, we are happy to offer these 2 trees in memory of the men of Blackpool who fight and die here in the Montmal forest.
Thank you. On behalf of the Blackpool Historical Society and the wider Blackpool community, I'd like to thank you and ONF and Mr. Legrand for all their help in our attempt to remember the men from Blackpool who died in the First World War. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the Irish Office of Forest has requested to have the trees checked for parasites that could lay eggs on the tree and make sure that they are safe to be sent to Ireland.
No problem. I speak English.
Just on behalf of the Blackpool Historical Society, we'd like to offer you my book, and also to warm the French nights. So a bottle of whiskey. Yeah, thank you for all your help, and again, we're delighted for all your hospitality and your help.
No.
Thank you.
It's for me normal to. This hospitality is normal for me. There is men of Blackpool who died here for us, and it's an honor for me. You welcome you here.
Thank you.
Welcome.
We are here at Fontaineaboy, and I'm here to lay a wreath in memory of my uncle, Dennis Jones, and I'm here on behalf of the whole Jones family.
We are in Fontaineaboy. It's a little village of 700 people, whose I am deputy mayor. For example, we have 2 military cemeteries in this small village, and a lot of cemeteries are all around. And especially this year, we are concerned by the sacrifice of these young men who went to défendre, to defend our liberty 1 century before. Of course, we have to be proud, French people, to be proud that people of Cork, but other English people, New Zealand people, sometimes we saw them in Fontainebleau coming to honor their soldiers. We are proud to commemorate with them the memory of a country. I have a special connection with Cork and with Ireland because in my life I had a job in sport, and 1 year the Tour de France I was in charge of, we started from Ireland and from Cork, and it's a good souvenir for me.
I just want to present this to the Deputy Mayor. It's a little plaque from the Royal Munster Fusiliers Association, of which Dennis Jones served with, and it's just a token of appreciation from us to you for helping to remember these soldiers and the sacrifice they made along with the French and the South Africans and the British soldiers. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Comment on dit applaus?
I really do think it's important to remember them. They went to war and they went for freedom. They wanted freedom for small countries. That's what the whole thing was about. And because they're not remembered, it's almost like they gave their lives for nothing in a sense.
I think it's very important because I think the whole thing was a mistake. I think it was just vanity on the part of the big shots in England, and it should never have happened.
So I think it's very important to remember them because they were brave young men who went to war to fight evil, and they died.
They really had no idea, I think, what they were heading into.
Life for these young men in the trenches would have been horrendous. That's the only word I could use to describe it. Young boys, in some cases only teenagers, from Blackpool and indeed from other places of Cork, would have went off, left the relative comfort of their homes, as it was then, and found themselves dealing in trench warfare on the Western Front. Now, what that would have entailed was a whole variety of things. They would have had to contend with gas, German artillery, battles where they would have expected to go over the front, but and the everyday existence was also difficult. They would have had loneliness, fear. They would have woke up not knowing if that day was to be their last. Married men would have been worried about their wives and children back home. How were they coping with the absence of a husband or a father? Boys with girlfriends would have been worried, missing their families and missing their girlfriends terribly. The conditions in some parts of the Western Front were also horrendous. Mud would have been a constant companion. This in turn would have drawn rats. There are accounts of rats nibbling at guys' ears, their fingers, their eyes when people were trying to sleep, like lice. And all of these would have led to disease, such as flus and various other things. And there was the smell, the constant smell of death permeating from no man's land, combined with the smell of human excrement. And it's hard to imagine a young boy of 17 or 18 leaving Blackpool, leaving the comforts of his home, the familiar surroundings of his family, and finding himself placed into that hell on earth, because that's the only way it could be described. And then having to fight, see their friends die. One day you're with your best friend, and the next day he's gone. Looking at sights such as limbs blown off, heads taken from the body, intestines spilling out, listening to your friends calling for help in no man's land after a battle, pleading for water, for somebody to rescue them, and you're stuck in the trenches knowing that there's nothing you can do, and you listen there to their cries getting fainter and fainter and fainter until they die. No, those are the conditions that these young men had to endure.
I feel sad about them really, as I do about the people during the famine. Their span of life was very short, and they just happened to be the ones that were, alive during these catastrophes, if you like. we were very lucky that we had a run of peace. And I think just by knowing their life, you kind of appreciate your own.
Well, I love history, and I think it's very important to remember why we are where we are today and how they fought for us.
If Germany had not been defeated, both in the First and Second World War, we wouldn't have the free world we have now.
What would have happened if Germany had taken over Europe? What situation would we have been in then? We'd have been in a pretty messy state, I would imagine, you know.
Remembrance of those who fought in the war has been a difficult subject in Ireland over the years. In the years that followed, definitely there was a huge veterans you would gather up in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. Thousands would gather on Remembrance Day. And here in Cork, on the South Mall, there was a monument erected and unveiled on St. Patrick's Day 1925 by the Cork Independent Ex-Servicemen's Club, primarily composed of working or middle-class veterans of the war. So that became the focal point for remembrance here in the city over the years. And each year, around Armistice Day or Remembrance Sunday, there would always be a small ceremony. The sad thing about that is that memorial only has 150 names. And the reason for that is families apparently had to pay to get a name put on that memorial. And most families simply didn't have the money for that. They didn't have the money to get their loved ones commemorated there. And others would have been so disillusioned by the loss of their loved one that they didn't want to have anything to do with it. But that memorial still stands, and like I said, it has been the focal point for commemoration here in Cork City over the years. Sadly, many families who lost a husband or a son or a brother didn't have the money to get out to the Western Front. So it's only in second generation and third generation people who have been able to make that pilgrimage, and I call it a pilgrimage, to the battlefields to see where their loved one is either buried or commemorated on a memorial. Loads of people are doing that, and I suppose the situation in Ireland has changed to allow people to realise that, you can do this. Because I've always believed that you could commemorate those who fought in the First World War, and it does not have to be at the expense of the honourable men and women who fought for Irish independence. Equally, we could commemorate the men and women who fought for Irish independence, and it does not have to be at the expense of those men who fought and died in the First World War. They were all our people. Their sacrifice was enormous, and they deserve to be remembered.
Well, I suppose as a former military man, I served over 40 years in the Irish Army, and I served in conflict, both in Cyprus and particularly in Lebanon, where the conflict is still going on. I am just totally blown away with the whole thing. I never realised the enormity and the excessive amount of people who were killed. I can't even come to terms with it. It's so serious. I think it's very sad, that lessons haven't been learned, and I suppose I'll never forget this trip. It'll be etched in my mind for the rest of my life.
It was a journey that led to the fields of France and Belgium, with these relatives to visit the graves of their loved ones, but also our neighbours, some of whom might not have been visited before. It was a memorable trip that will not be forgotten by all of us. Eileen Jones accompanied us on our trip, and we paid our respects at the grave of her uncle Dennis Jones in the forest where he died.
Before I visited the war graves in April, my uncles James and Dennis were just names. But after seeing the hundreds of white crosses, they became real people. Some of these people were fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, uncles and cousins. That is why I believe that this memorial is very important, lest we forget them. Because for them, when they died, no drum beat slowly, no fife played lowly, no one played the Dead March as they lowered them down, no band played the last post and chorus, No pipes play the flowers of the forest. May they rest in peace. Thank you.
We decided to bring back 2 trees from the forest where the last man from Blackpool was killed in action to plant in Blackpool, which we are doing today on the centenary of his tragic death only 1 week from the ending of the war. These trees are not only a representation of the close connection between the Irish community and those corresponding French communities where Irish soldiers trod, they are also a symbol of our hope for the future, based around the ideals that they fought and died for. Ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity, of a war that would end all wars. Symbolising that unity, we received 2 trees from the Forest de Mormal. One, a native French beech tree, and a second, a non-native oak tree that originally came from Germany. The oak was originally donated by the German government after the war to France as an act of reparation. These trees are growing side by side in the Forêt de Mormal today, and will do here in Blackpool, with our own Irish oak, a symbol of peace and hope for the future. Trees can save the world from climate change, and these trees here will hopefully act as a reminder to the people of Blackpool, not only of the sacrifice that Blackpool men, and especially those 142 men, made 100 years ago as liberators, but also about the tragedy of war that sears all communities, which leaves parents, siblings, spouses, lovers, friends, neighbours bereaved and forever heartbroken, no matter how righteous the cause. May this memorial make people, today and into the future, pause and reflect on these matters. The memory of these soldiers are no longer silent in Blackpool. Thank you.
Me husband's in Salonika, I wonder if he's dead. I wonder if he knows he has a kid with a foxy head. So right away, so right away, so right away, Salonika, right away, me soldier boy. And when the war is over, what will the slackers do? They'll be all around the soldiers for the loan of a bomb or two. So right away, so right away, so right away, Salonika, right away, me soldier boy.